Welcome to the Red Bull Theater Podcast, where guests discuss all things classical theater with your host, Nathan Winkelstein.
I'm so thrilled to welcome today's guest, one of the great theater practitioners, scholars, translators, adapters, and teachers, all rolled into a single intimidatingly brilliant presence, the inimitable Dakin Matthews. How are you, Dakin?
I'm fine. Thanks, Nathan. I'm a little overwhelmed, but okay.
Well, thank you, Dakin, so much for coming on to the pod. When I asked you to join, I was curious what you wanted to talk about as such an incredible practitioner and educator in the field of Shakespeare and verse. And you have what you call the common sense approach and multiple explorations of Shakespeare. And when I asked what speech you most enjoy using when first talking with people about verse, you came up with one that I would not have guessed, which is Bassanio from Merchant of Venice, right after he opens the lead casket in the test for Portia's hand in marriage in Act 3, Scene 2. I'm totally curious why that is your favorite speech, but maybe we should save that until after you've given it a read for people to follow along with.
Okay. The speech is about 35 lines long. Bassanio had been musing over the caskets. He's now over the lead casket, and he decides that that's the one rather than the gold or silver casket. He's been told in advance that there will be a picture of Portia inside of it and a note announcing that he's the winner. So he opens the lid and he says, "What find I here? Fair Portia's counterfeit. What demigod have come so near creation? Move these eyes? Or whether riding on the balls of mine seem they in motion? Here are severed lips parted with sugar breath. So sweet a bar should sunder such sweet friends. Here in her hairs the painter plays the spider, and hath woven a golden mesh to entrap the hearts of men faster than gnats in cobwebs. But her eyes, how could he see to do them? Having made one, methinks it should have power to steal both his and leave itself unfurnished. Yet look how far the substance of my praise doth wrong this shadow in underprizing it. So far this shadow doth limp behind the substance. Here's the scroll, the content and summary of my fortune. You that choose not by the view, chance as fair, and choose as true. Since this fortune falls to you, be content and seek no new. If you be well pleased with this, and hold your fortune for your bliss, turn you where your lady is, and claim her with a loving kiss. A gentle scroll. Fair lady, by your leave, I come by note to give and to receive. Like one of two contending in a prize that thinks he hath done well in people's eyes, hearing applause and universal shout, giddy in spirit, still gazing in a doubt whether these peals of praise be his or no, so, thrice fair lady, stand I even so, as doubtful whether what I see be true, until confirmed, signed, ratified by you. Okay.
Thank you. What is it, Dakin, that draws you to this speech as a way in to understanding Shakespeare's verse?
Okay, this speech is it's not a great speech. It's a wonderful speech, but it's not like one of the all-time greats. You wouldn't see it often in an audition, for example, if someone's trying to impress you, because it comes at what I think Merchant of Venice is kind of the peak of Shakespeare's technical perfection. When he first started, he was very careful to show off how good he was at writing good poetry and at writing good prose and at obeying the rules, and then showing off his facility with the figures of speech and things like that. And you were more aware that it was Shakespeare showing you what he can do. And as he moved through his work, I believe, there are other scholars who feel the same way, that he began to realize that he should stop showing off, stop saying, look how rhetorically or prosodically brilliant I am, and start using the rhetoric and the prosody to reveal the psyche of his characters. So that rather than it being Shakespeare using a figure of speech or Shakespeare using a rhetorical development, it was the character themselves doing it. And I think he followed through all the way. So that's the first point I want to make. That after the initial foray into showing off and writing brilliant little, puns and rhymes and stuff like that, he became really interested in character and how those two things, rhetoric and prosody, would reveal the psyche of the character rather than just show him off to be brilliant. And I think Merchant of Venice was where he reached the peak of what we might call technical, prosodic, and rhetorical perfection. He did everything he could with that. And then after that, he began to push the envelope and start to force both rhetoric and prosody into directions they had never gone before. His prosody became much more irregular. His rhetoric became much more surprising. His exploration of the psyche became much more deep and much more complex. So I don't want to start somebody off with the really tough stuff that occurred towards the end, because it's really hard, some of it. I mean, some of Leonti's speeches in Winter's Tale, for example, are. So I thought, well, here's a good one. Let's pick one that one can speak about rhetorically and prosodically without challenging too much the listener who doesn't know much about rhetoric and prosody. This one strikes me as almost a perfect entry point because it divides equally into three parts, like a Gaul. It is divided in three parts. And if you have a copy of this from Act 3, Scene 2, did we say? You can see that it actually does divide even visually into three parts. The first 17 lines are in blank verse. The next 8 lines are in thickly rhyming iambic tetrameter. And the last 10 lines are in rhyming couplets. Now, if my theory is correct, each change in prosody should reveal a change in psyche. That is, say, what Bassanio is thinking and feeling when he writes in blank verse should be different from the way he's thinking and feeling when he writes in rhyming couplets. So
And just to clarify, this would be unlike in some of his earlier work where a young playwright is showing off and is maybe changing both rhetoric and prosody simply to show that he can, is that at this point he's reached the point where he's marrying that to character dynamics, but he's not really pushing that envelope. That's where we're at right now.
I
And
think so.
for the and for audience, just I think most people will know, but just to double check, can you give us a few examples of forms of rhetoric that you're referring to? And then prosody just means the various types of verse and rhyme structure, correct?
Right. Okay. So first of all, for rhetoric is divided into two parts. Everybody studied rhetoric. Even Shakespeare in grammar school studied rhetoric in grammar school, and he studied it in Latin. So rhetoric is divided into two parts. The first part is I have an idea of something I want to say. What's the best approach to say it, to persuade people, to move people by what I have to say? So it has to do with picking the best method of developing an idea. That's what it's like freshman English. That's all. It hasn't changed in 400 years. There's still introduction, topic sentence, and then body paragraphs that explore the topic sentence by developing it by either giving instances or a chronological order or a narrative order, and then you do a conclusion. That's standard rhetorical practice. The other part of rhetoric is after you've decided how to organize your thoughts, what particular way do you write them down that has the most ability, the highest ability to impress your audience? And that's where what we call figures of speech come in, which for us means images, but it meant something different for Shakespeare. It meant anytime you depart from simple speech and twist it to make it a little bit more interesting. So that could be that you use images like metaphors or similes. But it could also mean you balance phrases against one another, or you repeat words in an interesting way, or you repeat consonants in an interesting way, or you rhyme, all things that have to do with the sounds of words. So those two things you could do, imagery and playing with the sounds of words, are part of the figures of speech thing. And the one where you play with the meanings of words by using images, for example, is called a trope. Now, we mean something different by it now, but that's what it meant for Shakespeare. Where you play around with the sounds of words, either the actual sounds or the rhythms of words, that's called a scheme. And the one we know most of all is the rhyme scheme. When you play with the sounds of words in such a way that the ends sound the same, that's choosing to use a figure of speech that somehow enhances what you have to say. Okay? Uh, Poetry scheme, just the scheme, a metrical scheme is another way. That's one that plays with the sounds of words, with their specific rhythms to help you make the point. So here is a piece where he uses two different metrical schemes and three different rhyme schemes. In the first 17 lines, he uses unrhymed iambic pentameter. In the second,
And this is what most people would know as Shakespeare's
verse.
free verse, his
Br-
traditional blank verse.
blank verse. So he uses blank verse. In the last 10 lines, he uses rhyming couplets. Those are still iambic pentameter, 10 syllable, 5 beat lines. And the middle, he uses a tetrameter and it rhymes it very thickly. So now we say, okay, now let's look at his prosodic choices here. What is an iambic pentameter? It's usually, they called them decasyllables, by the way. Shakespeare never used the phrase iambic pentameter. He did use the phrase blank verse, but he never said iambic pentameter. He called them numbers. He called poetry numbers. It was basically about counting. So basically, according to his practice and the practice of those who went before him, an iambic pentameter line is 10 or 11 syllables with the English words placed in such a way that accented words will always fall on the even syllables. And that the line will build from the beginning to the end and sort of have a little pause at the end. That's the pure iambic pentameter. It would go da-dum, 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 da-dum. And the last one is kind of like a emphatic, slightly emphatic, and is followed by a slight pause. So that was what he inherited from 100 years before, and through practice, most plays were written like that. And that's what he played with. That's what he decided. I love C.S. Lewis when he talks about this. He says this is how the English poets were going to try to write good poetry. They didn't want to do the sort of old English poetry anymore. They wanted to sort of steal from what the French and the Italians were doing, but they still needed something a little bit stronger than that. So they decided that regular recurring rhythm with 5 beats per line was the one that was the best for English. C.S. Lewis says it soon became kind of monotonous or self-defeating because it couldn't account for the variety of English speech quite well. It fit perfectly well. You can speak an iambic pentameter very easily, but it gets monotonous after a while. So he said some poets decided to stick with it. They were just going to write regular 5-beat verse. And some poets decided to play with it. I'm not going to have the accents always fall on the even numbered syllables. I'm not going to have the last syllable, the most important syllable in the line. I'm not going to run from the beginning to the end. I'm going to break in the middle upon occasion. Sometimes right in the middle, but you can't actually break a pentameter line in the middle because you're going to end up with 3 on one side and 2 on the other. So I'm going to break it somewhere near the middle, and then maybe I'll break it closer to the beginning, or maybe so they experimented. C.S. Lewis said the poets who decided to stick with the regularity are like ship pilots who put out to sea but sail as close to the shoreline as possible. He says the experimenters were like ship pilots who put out to sea and sail as far from the shoreline as possible, but never lose sight of it. So that's a great image for me. That's what it is. So now we're going to see when you decide not to be regular, what are you saying about the character's psyche? He's perfectly capable. Shakespeare can write perfectly regular pentameter, and he wrote a lot more of it in the early plays that he wrote. But over the course of his life, of all the iambic pentameter lines he wrote, less than 25% are in fact regular iambic pentameter. That is to say, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. The other 75 to 80% have some variation. Whether it's
Was that a steady evolution? You say that it evolved over time. Was it a steady evolution, or was there a moment where he started like you mentioned that this is the peak of his prosaic kind of perfection? Was it after this speech that
well,
he
no, he's already
strongly
he's already begun experimenting. He's
okay,
already begun experimenting. See, some variations don't sound like they're variations. Some variations can be incorporated into a 5-beat line, but some variations really challenge it, and some variations really violate it. So here he's staying with the variations that stay within the 5-beat line, challenge it a little bit, but he doesn't push it too far. When you
got
are when the poem is very regular, it sort of indicates that the character is in a state of emotional balance. In other words, balance of speech represents balance of emotional life or balance of your psychic life. When the speech is extremely irregular, I think he's suggesting an imbalance in your psychic life, an excess of emotion or confusion about what you know or what you think or what you want. And that's obvious. It seems like an obvious choice, but to apply it to prosaic stuff, to prose, look at these lines. In the first 17 lines, he opens the box. He's got the picture. He knows he's won, but it does not put him in a state of balance because the discovery is so emotionally overwhelming. And so he says, "What is this?" He knows perfectly well what it is. What is this? Oh my God. It looks like it's alive. The eyes look like they're moving. The hair looks like it's trapping gnats. The lips look like they're parted with sugar breath. You know, it's a painting. You can't paint breath and you can't paint sugar. So not only is he having extreme figures of speech, his prosody is completely broken up into short little questions that break mid-line. Sometimes the line breaks in the middle, sometimes it runs on at the end. There's no sense of the ends of lines here. What find I here? Fair Portia's counterfeit. What demigod hath come so near creation? Move these eyes? Or whether riding on the balls of mine seem they in motion? Here are severed lips parted with sugar breath. So sweet a bar should sunder such sweet friend. There are breaks in the majority of the lines. So he is not honoring this idea that the pentameter should build regularly to the end stress at the end of the line. He's breaking that up completely prosodically. He's not rhyming at all. So the prosody, the rhythmic structure, should alert us that the psyche is still in a state of imbalance. He is still reacting emotionally to it. He does not have control of the awe and overwhelming sense of victory that he has here.
if I can ask, this is interesting, I think, compared to what a lot of people think of Shakespeare, is what you're basically saying is there's that thing that I think we both consider incorrect, that there's no such thing as subtext in Shakespeare. Because what you're saying here is that at its face, if we just look at it, we're seeing a man who's just gotten what he most wants in his life, who then spends 17 lines talking about a picture. But
Yep.
that what you're saying is that what the language is telling us is that for the actor, he's talking about a picture, but that's not why he's talking. He is in the way we do when something incredible happens. He is gravitating towards the thing in front of him and imbuing it with a whole bunch of his emotional life, even though it's just a picture.
Yeah, he's trying to anchor that emotion to something physical so that he can control it. This is the most The most obviously for us now, post Freud and post Jung and post psychology and post psychoanalysis, this analysis of oh my God, I'm having this overwhelming experience. I must grab something, or I'm going to float off into the ether. So he grabs the picture, and he just talks about the picture for a while, because it gives him a chance to gather himself so that he can then say something meaningful. You know what I mean? So they can have an appropriate reaction to what's just happened. Because so it's just such a psychological insight about how human beings behave. And the clue is not just in the images, the fact that he focuses rhetorically on I'm going to talk about the picture. I'm going to talk about the picture. I'm going to make a rhetorical choice to talk about this thing in front of me because what just happened to me is so overwhelming. So he does, but he talks about it in a way that reveals how emotional he is at that time. And the same thing is true. Not just the prosody reveals that choice, but the extravagance of the images. If you are trying to make a very rational argument, you try not to use extravagant images that are somewhat questionable. You try not to say things that, however impressive, happen to be untrue. No, the more extreme the metaphor, the less likely it is to be logically convincing. It may be very impressive, it may move you, but he's saying, are these eyes moving, or are they riding on my eyeballs? He claims that there is breath, that someone has painted breath. He claims that someone has painted sugar. He claims that lips are like friends. Why are they like friends? Well, because they're always kissing. One the bottom lip, and then he goes back to the eyes. Again, he reveals the knowledge that when you look at a painting of a portrait, you always go to the eyes first, and you always come back to the eyes. So he reveals he even knows that about it. He says, I can't explain why this picture is so moving. Some demigod must have created. In other words, he says extravagant things. He compares the woman's hair to cobwebs catching gnats. What could be more inappropriate as a praise of this? You know what I mean? So the extravagance of his imagery and the almost uncontrollableness of his imagery, just popping from one thing to another. Okay? He goes back to the idea of how could the painter do this, which is the first thing he started. And you get the feeling, he's coming full circle now, which generally, when you come full circle, means you're starting to gain control. What I said about the painter, I'm going to go back to the painter again. How could he make it? How could he do this? Because if he painted one of them, it should have stolen his and he wouldn't have been able to paint the other one. And then he says something really interesting. He has the last four lines here, where that short little kind of what's this stops, and he makes a long comparison, a long simile, not a metaphor anymore, but now a simile. Yet look how far the substance of my praise doth wrong this shadow in underprizing it, so far this shadow doth limp behind the substance. What is he saying there? It's no longer these wild metaphors. It's no longer this excited kind of interjections of awe and wonder and beauty. He's saying, and you know what? As beautifully as I praised this picture, my praise of the picture fell short of how beautiful the picture actually is. How far short? As far short as this picture fell of Portia. So he makes a rational, brilliant twist at the end by saying, I wasn't actually praising the picture. I was actually praising the picture in order to praise Portia, which signals that he now has gained a kind of control over this emotional experience and is now saying what he should be saying. He's praising Portia.
So instead of just now kind of flipping myself into actor mode, this is the moment where he's able to basically self-examine. He's gone from reactive to a self-examination of what he's doing. And you can see that in the choice of rhetoric.
Right. And so the line starting on line 13 is one long sentence almost 4 lines long, which is a very complex comparison, not easy to understand, and a little bit robbed of its vitality of imagery. The image is not terribly strong in here, but he's trying to make a compare. He's trying to make a point. And at that point now he feels, okay, now I can reach in and grab the scroll. And it's going to tell me what I won. Although he already knows what he's won, but he's again now going to anchor on something else. He finally got to the place emotionally where he can do this. But now again, he's going to anchor on that. So he reads it very carefully. What's wonderful about the scroll is it is so overly rhetorically and prosodically determined. It doesn't just rhyme, it rhymes in fours. It's not just verse, it's almost pure regular verse. You are almost forced to go, you that choose not by the view, chance as fair and choose as true. Since this fortune falls to you, be content and seek no new. If you be well pleased with this and hold your fortune for your... almost every line starts with a strong beat and missing non-stress verb. And it just boom, 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 boom. The folk poetry, when Shakespeare needed to write something that was clearly poetry, something that was clearly prepared, non-off the cuff, had some mysteriousness about it, or had some folkness about it, or had some sort of quality of folk wisdom, or whatever it is, that's what he did. So Bersani is no longer making his poetry up, he's reading somebody else's poetry. Which, of course...
And it's almost Dr. Seussian.
Yeah.
It divides perfect mathematical, it goes sing-song. Yeah.
Which is an additional aid to him to gain control of himself. He's not required to say anything now. He can simply read somebody else's writing and make sure he's got it clear. And not only is the line prosodically extremely regular, there are no figures of speech in it. There are no metaphors, no similes, no strong imagery. There's a little bit of, there's schematic, you got the alliteration. You have the balance, perfect balance. Every line leads to the end. Every line is balanced by the next line. It's a perfect example. So, and now he gets to the third part. He's been on a psychological journey. He's gained control of the enormous emotion that he feels. He knows he's won. Now he's got specific instructions. He says, if you like this, you made a right choice. If you're happy with this choice, then don't go looking for any other woman. You go over there to that woman and claim her with a kiss. So those are his instructions. And then he starts the third section. And we notice, I call this the hourglass effect. All that emotional journey of the first piece is narrowed down to that little neck of thickly rhyming tetrameter and comes out at the other end in a neat rhyming pile. In other words, he now starts to rhyme. Both the effect that the poetry has had on him chooses him to rhyme, but also the rhyme suggests a man in control. And not just reacting to something, but composing himself and composing his reaction. In other words, anything that is more organized suggests a more organized psyche. It's just that simple. So what does he say? I love this last thing. First of all, notice how, unlike the earlier section, not many of the lines have breaks in the middle. They pretty much always go to the end where the rhyme is. So there's a nice iambic pentameter flow that we did not have in the first part. The beat was very interrupted in the first. Here the beat is pretty regular. A gentle scroll, fair lady, by your leave. I come by note to give and to receive. Like one of two contending in a prize that thinks he hath done well in people's eyes. You almost never get that many lines of regular iambic pentameter in Shakespeare. The only times he does it is he's booking. He's making deposits into the prosodic bank because he's going to pull out a big check pretty soon. Then he reverses the first foot of the next few lines, hearing applause and universal shout, giddy in spirit still gazing in a doubt, whether these peals of praise be his or no. And then he goes, so, thrice, fair, lady, stand I even so. After 6 or 8 lines of utterly regular pentameter, he pulls out a 7 or 8 beat line, which says, I'm stopped dead. So, of course, the prosody, the way he now puts so many stresses in that line, also stops the music of the prosody dead. It's the perfect sort of sonic representation of going, ha, 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 ha. Boom. So the prosody, the rhythm or the stopped rhythm, the dense rhythm of the 33rd line, where he says, I'm stopped. I don't know what to do. I got instructions, but I can't do it. And then he goes to the coda, because I don't know whether everything that I just saw is true until confirmed, signed, ratified by you. So, and that's that wonderful, what I call the 3 bells. He goes, as doubtful whether what I see be true until confirmed, signed, ratified by you. 3 bell, bong, 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 right at the end. It's just the music.
Signed, sealed, delivered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Signed, sealed, delivered.
So it's the same as signed, sealed, delivered.
Okay. So we look at the process.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
So this control section is interesting to me because you see rhyming couplets do a bunch of different things in Shakespeare and his contemporaries. The one that's coming to my mind right now is not a good example because it's not a well-known play, but in Sejanus, when Sejanus and Tiberius are talking to one another, they talk in rhyming couplets, which in that one seems to very much imply they're being very careful with each other. They're sort of dancing a dance. And so I guess my question here is he under control or is he being controlled because it's so scary to kiss her, right? Like there's just that subtle difference between those two. Yeah, is Shakespeare telling us one or the other or offering?
Well, sometimes you have to decide. That's what an actor has to decide. I just finished a session of my Shelter with Shakespeare where I'm analyzing a very controlled speech by Hermione. And it doesn't mean because she's unemotional, it means she's so emotional that she forces the control on it so she doesn't lose control, basically. So, but I think in this case, when you analyze what he's saying, not just the way he's saying it, he is in an odd way taking a kind of control, but there's a further twist at the end. What does he say? Now we're going to look at the rhetoric, the imagery. Fair lady, by your leave, I come by note to give and to receive. Now we know to give and to receive from Troilus and Cressida is sort of a play on words, because there's a scene in Troilus and Cressida when somebody asks, when you kiss, do you give or receive? And the answer is you do both. A kiss is to give and receive. So he's making a pun here. He's walking over and he says, by your leave, which is asking her permission for something. And he was already told, just go claim her. Go kiss her. That's your claim. Right. But he walks up to her and he says, excuse me, I've got this note which says I can kiss you. And then he says, but I don't know if I can. Like one of two contending in a prize that thinks he hath done well in people's eyes, hearing applause and universal shout, giddy in spirit, still gazing in doubt whether these peals of praise be his or no. So thrice fair lady, stand I even so. He says, I can't do it. What this note tells me to do, I can't do it unless or until confirmed, signed, ratified by you. He is basically saying, I'm not going to kiss you. You have to kiss me. Her kiss is the confirmation, is the seal. If she permits the kiss or if she kisses him first. In other words, you'll find a lot of editors will put, he kisses her there, fair lady, by your leave. He kisses her. I don't think so. I think he's saying, I got this note. And now there's another wonderful play on words. You notice everything in the last section is simile rather than metaphor. Like this, like that. Similes are always more rational than metaphors. Metaphors are reactive emotionally. Similes are constructing a reaction. And he has.
Can you explain that?
Well, in a simile, you have to make a comparison. You have to say, this is like this. if I say this coffee is hot, that's a statement. If I say this coffee is blazing, that's a metaphor. If I say this coffee is hot as hell, that's a simile. This coffee is blazing is more reactive and immediate. There is no medium between the coffee and the blazing. It just says something untrue and says it's emotionally true to me. It may not be literally true. Whereas a simile is literally true. It is like that. So a simile always is a bit more rational control than a metaphor. He has two metaphors here. The middle one, of course, is like the race or the whatever it is this contention is of two. It can't be a wrestling match because you know if you threw the other guy. It's got to be some kind of contest where the outcome is unsure to the participant. And he hears the cheering, but he doesn't know if it's for him. So somebody's got to tell him he won. That's the middle one. And it's sort of wonderful. Giddy gazing, peals of praise, applause, universal.
And that's a simile.
That's a simile.
That's a simile, right? Because he says like.
Like one of two. But then he comes in, I come by note to give and to receive. And there's a buried joke in here, which is a note is also a banknote. And giving and receiving is deposits and withdrawals. When you travel, banks don't have branches in the Renaissance. You have to get a note from your bank that allows you to go to a bank in the town you go to, that allows you to make deposits and withdrawals in those banks, and it will be okay. So I come by note to give and to receive, but I don't believe the note's any good unless you sign it, confirm it, and ratify it. So he goes to mercantile image here, which, of course, the play is called The Merchant of Venice. I call this an imagery hamburger. He's got the top piece of bread is the banknote, the bottom piece of bread is the banknote, and in between is this wonderful meat of the race, the contention. So he uses a double imagery here, one of which is a kind of a pun or a double meaning, an equivocation, which is the top and the bottom, where clearly give and receive means kiss, but it also means deposit and withdrawal. Confirm, sign, and ratify also mean kiss, but it also means put the seal on the note, bank it, It's just such control in the second one. In other words, the control he initiated with, look how far this shadow is to fall behind the sun so far, that comparing control that he had, he now extends all the way to the last sequence. So if someone comes up to this, not only does it give you examples of three kinds of poetry, blank verse, densely rhyming tetrameter, and rhyming couplets, it also gives you two kinds of rhetoric at least, or three kinds of rhetoric, absolutely absence of figures of speech, heavily metaphorical and emotional figures of speech, heavily rational and simile figures of speech. And it's like a perfect, it's like it's like a paradigm. If somebody said, what do you think blank verse is best at doing? What do you think rhyming verse is best at doing? Here it is right here. You can always go back to this and say, now these aren't hard and fast rules. Again, people can use blank verse for perfectly non-emotional purposes, and people can use rhyming verse for perfectly, emotional and upsetting. But it's just a way how Shakespeare manipulates the verse form and the rhetorical choices to give you an aperçu to the internal, emotional, and psychic life of the character. So when you say there's a journey, you can justify it by showing you the journey.
And to go forest through trees for a second, what you are taking for granted, which I think many people do, and I certainly do, but I think also many people don't, is that Shakespeare is not, as he might have in his earlier plays, not using this rhetoric for his own means, but is rather using rhetoric to provide illumination into the character's psyche, and we are deep into the details of how to examine that. But I think because it is not taken as for granted as it should be, I just want to state very clearly that the base assumption here is that you are not doing Shakespeare, quote unquote, right, simply by following the rhetoric and the prose. Rather, the rhetoric and the prose are clues as how to perform a character truthfully. Am I saying
Yes,
that
only
accurately?
yes, absolutely, but it's a double thing because the rhetoric and the prosody also have an effect upon the audience. So first
Okay.
of all, they are there to help the actor enter into the psychology of the character and at the moment that he is speaking. But they also have an exact effect upon an audience. When an audience hears the irregularity of the first speech, they interpret that as confusion or emotion. When they hear the regularity of the last part of the speech, they interpret that as the character's in control of himself. You know what I mean? So when they hear the extreme images of the first part or the controlled image of the second, they have a different reaction. So it works both ways. It's sort of bivalent. For the actor, it's like acting clues. For the audience, it's like interpretive clues. What should I think about this character? Well, look at how they're talking. Just the way we do. When we listen to people, we not only listen to what they say, but how they say it for clues about what they're thinking. So the audience gains information from that, but only if the actor relays that information the way Shakespeare intended. If I were a kind of person who believed, which I am not, that you always pause at the end of every line and you never pause in the middle of the line, then you are going to give the audience incorrect information. You're going to say, "What find I here? Fair Portia's counterfeit, what demigod hath come so near creation move these eyes? Or whether riding on the balls of mine, seem they in motion, here are severed lips." It doesn't work. It doesn't work. In other words, so you must be sensitive to what the effect is going to have on the audience and also to the effect that it's going to have as you and the actor to interpret and to deliver. What I say sometimes, get out of the way of what Shakespeare's doing. Don't try to impose a regularity on Shakespeare that he deliberately has not written in the speech.
How so you are what I would describe as perhaps the single most fluent person in Shakespeare's verse and rhetoric and prosody. It is English, it is modern English, but there are obviously particular this fluency in the use of rhetoric and prosody is a skill. How would an actor, a practitioner, or let's say a reader, someone who's not receiving it through the interpretation of an actor, how would they begin to explore these depths that you exist in so comfortably yourself?
Yeah, that's a really hard question because two things. First of all, there are some actors who don't know anything about prosody or rhetoric and are wonderful Shakespearean actors simply because they have read enough and they've got this unique talent by which language for them has a kind of a immediacy and transparency. I mean, some of the best actors I know couldn't do this kind of analysis. They don't want to. If they tried to do it, it would get in their way. They just understand the link between a person's language and what they're thinking and feeling. So that's the first thing. Second, I don't think I do this myself anymore. I've been doing it for so long that it's become kind of second nature. And so someone pick up a speech and just read it and will not have analyzed it. And then I'll teach the same speech to a student and you kind of go, "Oh, wow, I knew this intuitively, but I actually now have to explain how it actually works." So that's the second thing. I don't always follow my own method. My method is a kind of a beginner's method. Start to do this and then you'll gradually become second nature. But I say I lay down three simple rules. Know what you're saying, know why you're saying it, and the third one is the hard one. Figure out why you're saying it the way you're saying it. Now, the actor's job is the same for every play in know what you're saying and know why you're saying it. What do the words mean? What are my intentions? The third one is the hard one. Why is he saying it this particular way? And sometimes you have to do a little hard work, but scanning is not going to solve that problem. Scanning is not going to answer your question because, as I say, 80% of Shakespeare's lines and the great lines of the late, middle, and late plays, 80% don't scan. They don't scan in the sense of scanning and being regular. So scan is not going to solve it. understanding human nature and reading a lot of Shakespeare and making a commitment to orality, what I would say, that you value the language, not the feel. You don't play the feeling. You figure out what kind of feeling that would be that underlies the language, but it's always the language that does the job. I don't know. You have to. I learned by I had a double life because I was also a university professor at this time, so I did a lot of scholarly work. But I also learned by working with actors who were better than I was, listening to what they do and listening to what gets over to an audience. You know.
Yeah, this is very interesting to me. I mean, I have two responses to what you just said. It's very interesting that your three rules in a slightly different order are very similar to Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, which I'm not sure if you've heard of, but is a methodology for going about almost anything, which is that you must know the why, how, what, and of anything you do. And that basically what you're saying is the why and the what of Shakespeare is the same as with any acting text. It might be a little trickier to figure out the what because the language is a little bit older.
Yeah.
But the how is quite complex.
Yes.
And requires an understanding of the rhetorical devices and prosaic devices that Shakespeare was using in his day. Does that sound about right? That's a different way of saying what you said?
I mean, I can't teach anybody how to act, but as my wife says, you can't teach anybody to act, but you can teach them how to act better. So I can help them do better, but if they don't have a natural sense of how language and thought and emotion are connected to one another, a love of language, it's pretty hard to make any point because it's like trying to teach somebody who's not a natural athlete how to swing a golf club. All the rules just get in the way.
Right.
It's really hard. It's really hard.
This is a notoriously slippery question. So I hesitate to ask it, but I will ask it anyway. It is notoriously difficult to try to make any real grounded assumptions about Shakespeare the human. But Shakespeare the playwright, do you believe that Shakespeare the playwright was making the choices that you're describing at the level of detail that you're describing front brain consciously, or do you think, like the great actors who do it, he was a genius who was experimenting in his form, and it is our job to then kind of step that back into understandable steps? Or do you think he was writing with these steps in mind?
Well, first of all, I think he was natural genius, but from our knowledge of the kind of education he went through and from the way he developed his craft, it seems fairly clear that he knew what he was doing. These were not native wood notes wild, If we can analyze it to show how specific his rhetorical and prosodic choices were, then the chances are that he knew what he was doing. Now, as an actor who does a lot of Shakespeare, can somehow become Shakespeare becomes his native tongue, and he no longer makes these choices consciously, or what I call he no longer attends to the gear shift. The shifting of gears. But when you first start, your focus on that gear shift is astonishing. And after a while, you just automatically shift, and you pump the clutch and the brake and whatever it is that you're not thinking about it anymore. It becomes a second nature. What do you call it? I think certainly he became quite second nature about this. He didn't. It came out of him. Johnson said, he never blotted a line. I should have blotted 1,000. Johnson was wrong about that. But I think it came out of him from the practice of 20 years of writing this way, that he could write, brilliantly without actually focusing very hard on it. But what he produced was the result of 20 years labor. It's like, the plumber says, you're not paying me for the 20 minutes I fixed your drain. You're paying me for the 20 years I've been a plumber. The same thing is true with Shakespeare. It may look like he just wrote it easily, but there's 20 years of study. And the fact that he continued to develop over and there being actually market development suggests to me that there was a lot of a study. He had a great respect for, we use the word art rather loosely. Art meant exactly the opposite in the Renaissance of what it means today. Today, it tends to mean inspired work. In Shakespeare's time, it meant studied work. The kind of work you do when you study something for a long time. Art in Shakespeare's day never meant fine art. It meant the kind of craftsmanship that comes from study and practice.
That's fascinating. Because a lot of what you're describing, I very easily in today's culture associate with sports stars. Of when you hear about the level of complexity and work that goes in behind the scene to make it look easy when Michael Jordan floats through the air and touches the ball in amidst the trees of behemoths, is there's a lot of work that goes into that easy moment. And it's the same, both you're saying, both for Shakespeare the practitioner and the writer, and also it sounds like many of the best practitioners of Shakespeare, they make it seem so easy and precise and specific because they have worked so hard on it. This is the throwing the book out metaphor of you have to write the book and then you have to throw it away type thing.
I think that's true. And I think what one has to give the impression as an actor that this is how nobody talks this way, but this is how I talk. This is how I talk.
Right.
This is the way.
Yeah. Well, it's a fantasy anyway.
Yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. But this, again, I say this is not a great piece, and it's just such a good demonstrative piece. You can always go back to it and see, yeah, look there are actual prosodic and rhetorical choices being made by the playwright that have a real effect upon both how the audience hears it and how the actor should approach it. And the actor's job is if he's not sure about what he's saying, find out what you're saying. If you're not sure about why you're saying it, find out why you're saying it. The hows will fall into place after you answer those two questions, I think.
And let me jump back. This was something you said right at the beginning, and I didn't want to interrupt. You mentioned when talking about various playwrights, and you mentioned the playwrights that stay close to shore and the playwrights that go out and keep an eye on the shore. And it was interesting that you said playwrights, plural. And are there other playwrights of this era who you think were able, either briefly or often, to rise to the same level of, for lack of a better term, rebellious truth in their writing as Shakespeare?
Okay. I probably, that C.S. Lewis metaphor was about poets, not about playwrights, first of all. So I should probably have made that clear. In fact, when he wrote it, he actually excluded, it's in his book of the Oxford History of English Literature, and he's really talking about poets. I apply it to playwrights, and I don't think you get the early English plays like Gorboduc or something like that. The iambs and the rhythms are very, very regular. Then you get Marlowe, who kind of explodes it a little bit, not so much through irregularity as through kind of expanding the line, and it's hard. They called his line a mighty line, Marlowe's mighty line. He taught them about the rhythmic flexibility of the line, not so much about rhythmic irregularity of life, if that makes any sense. But there were very few playwrights. Once they began to explore, the variations were pretty much universally accepted. Shakespeare went the furthest on his variations, but any of the writers, Fletcher, for example, never went as far as Shakespeare does. Fletcher still likes the build to the end of the line. You know what I mean? You can actually tell what parts Fletcher wrote, what parts Shakespeare wrote by just examining their prosody. Shakespeare went the farthest. I don't think there are. But what's interesting to me is that nowadays, when people try to write in a Shakespearean mode, like the Charles III play, you know that one?
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
They write a very regular pentameter.
Yes, they do.
And the trick is that that's what Shakespeare did not do. He did not.
Right. It's very Johnsonian.
Yeah. It's just, and Johnson was the one who thought, the next person to take over the poetic mantle of irregularity, of course, was John Donne. And that's what Johnson hated. He says John Donne broke the back of meter by the level of his irregularities, destroyed the beat, and Johnson hated that. But Donne wrote great poetry.
Right. So we are coming. We're nearing the end of our time. I've already asked too much time of you already, but I do want to ask. So, what if once Shakespeare started experimenting and the other playwrights started experimenting, everyone moved that way? This is an almost impossible question, but I've already hit you with a couple of almost impossible questions, so I just want to see what
Yeah.
you have to say about it. What is it that truly differentiates Shakespeare from both his contemporaries and, well, let's keep it simple. Let's say from his contemporaries, from other English writers of the era. Why does he always stand out, even for those of us who adore Marlowe and Johnson? It's still hard to stand on the ground that anyone is anywhere close to Shakespeare. Why do you think that is at its core?
I think there are two. The first one, which is the less important one, is he's a great dramaturg. He really constructs plots well, and makes the plots interplay with one another for the to proceed to find the dominant theme of the play. He borrowed. He never wrote an original story, but when he borrowed the
Right.
story, he figured out how to put it in a plot, which is a way to do it in 2.5 to 3 hours on a stage. So he was a great plotter. But for me, the one is that he was ruthless in exploring the human psyche, what it is to be a human being. And no one ever came close to that for my money. I mean, some came closer to what it might be to be a slightly weird human being. I mean, he had a generosity of spirit and acceptance of the human nature. I mean, the last four of his plays all end up saying pardon, pardon, forgive, mercy, forgive, forgive. I mean, he reached a point where when he got to the great romances, basically forgiveness, whereas in the middle comedies, marriage was the answer. In the end comedies, forgiveness, acceptance of human nature is the answer. And it's sort of wonderful that the last thing he wrote for himself probably was the epilogue to The Tempest. And basically, Prospero says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. As you from crimes been pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. He says, forgive me and you'll be forgiven. So he reaches that point, or at the end of Cymbeline, pardons the word for all. Prospero forgives everybody, even though they don't deserve it. So that human kindness, I guess, is what it is, and sympathy for what it means to be human. Even the villains get a certain amount of sympathy. You know what I mean? So his willingness,
Yeah,
never to stop exploring the depths and complexity of the human condition.
I think that's lovely. I think
this speech here is a good example that Bassanio, he is actually charting a very complex journey that someone is going on, where I won, but I'm confused. I can use that confusion. Wait a minute, I can do it. Here's the letter. Oh, do I go kiss her? No, I don't. I ask her to kiss me. I mean, that's a surprise. That journey is a surprise. And that we look for more. If you look for more surprises, I think it's more interesting than if you think everything is kind of set and you're not going to get character development. Even the smallest characters every once in a while get a moment, where their humanity shines through. So I think that's his sensitivity to the complexity of human emotion and human reason. I think that's what, and the fact that finally he says, reason is not going to solve our problems. Mercy is going to solve it. It's not going to solve our problems, but to make life livable. So he's a great humanitarian, I think.
Yeah, I think the what I've always thought as a theater practitioner is that theater practitioners' superpowers, as much as we'd like to pretend it's intelligence, it's not. Theater practitioners' superpower is empathy and imagination. And it sort of sounds like what you're saying is that Shakespeare was one of the greatest.
Yeah.
Of he could empathize and he could imagine what somebody was feeling and how to try to begin to describe that.
Yeah.
Empathy and imagination.
What Keats called negative capability, the ability to insert
Yes.
anybody else's psyche and find sympathy there or empathy. Somebody calls theater a gym for empathy. I forget. I just read that somewhere. Theater is the gym for empathy.
Yeah, and it's something that the world can use, so that it makes
of
one feel
also-
good about one's craft.
I kind of will have to apologize that I know this level of technical knowledge is often off-putting, and it's not nearly as neat as some director or coach who can get you to sort of express kind of impressionistic feelings and emotions and stuff like that. But for me, it's been the key that this technical knowledge is not the goal in and of itself, but the means to seeing how empathetic, how unique Shakespeare is in portraying the human condition.
I don't think there's anything to apologize for, Dakin. To go back to the sports metaphor,
Yeah.
we all understand that in sports, the goal is to put the ball in the various place. And sometimes you got to worry about how exactly you step and how exactly you flick your wrist to get there. And I think we sometimes forget how important that is in theater as well. So I actually think it's a really important reminder, and you provided us a roadmap for how to do it. So I so appreciate you, your time, your expertise, and your giving and your empathy and your imagination. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you. It's been great. It's been great.
Well, our revels now are ended. Until next time, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Red Bull Theater Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcasting platform. Your support helps us to bring you more captivating conversations and insights into the world of classic theater. To stay updated on our latest activities, follow us on social media, get on our mailing list, and visit www.redbulltheater.com, where you'll find an abundance of podcasts, readings, classes, seminars, productions, and more. Your support makes all of this possible, so please consider making a tax-deductible donation on our website to help us continue bringing classical theater to contemporary audiences. Until next time, thanks, and ever thanks.